Okay, cool. So I'll just start. I'll start here. We have Justin and Peter here today. Thanks everyone for your submissions. We had a lot of good questions come in. And so I'll just kind of run you through what's going to happen today. But before I do that, I just want you to I want the speakers or the experts to kind of introduce themselves. So Justin, do you want to give a little bit of background on who you are and how your experience with transitioning?
Yeah, for sure. So, quick intro on me. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pace, which is a new startup in I'll call it like the modern go-to-market stack. So, we're building tools for salespeople at PLG companies, which was really heavily inspired by my time at MongoDB. And so, some context there. I was at the company for about 6 years. I joined in 2015 when it was maybe 250 people, maybe in the range of 10 to $15 million of revenue, 100% sales-led growth. We sold into the Global 2000, Fortune 500 type companies. About a year into our time, we rolled out a product called MongoDB Atlas, which is very close to an AWS-like service, which is on-demand, self-service. There was a free tier, pay as you go, pay for what you use. But at that time, we also had, probably hundreds of salespeople. So when I first started, I was in sales management. I was in that role for about 3 years, and my claim to fame there was really help crack the code on how to work with the self-service motion to drive revenue and in a way that was good for the customer. And while my team was having a lot of success, the broader org was just struggling with going through this transformation. And probably because we were selling so much of the product, I built a great relationship with the chief product officer and ended up getting promoted into a new role where I reported into him. And I really had a cross-functional type mandate. And really, I thought about my responsibilities in two ways. One, how can I reduce friction between the customer and the company, mainly on the go-to-market side? And then number two, how do I increase efficiency, right? We had 1 million free tier users, 40,000 paying accounts, maybe 250,000 monthly active users. And that's what really helped inspire Pace was how do we start to use data to figure out which customers to engage, when and why? And how do we make our team more productive and those engagements more overall positive? So that's more in the area of what we're focusing on at Pace. And I'll kick it over to Peter, who I also met at MongoDB and works at Pace.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and thanks, Laura, for the intro. I'm Peter. Nice to meet you all. As Justin mentioned, I also did a stint at MongoDB between about 2015 and 2018. So in the year leading up to the launch of our really successful PLG product, and then for a few years as we scaled it. More recently, I was leading growth marketing at a company called Gremlin, which is also in the software infrastructure space. We really kind of dipped our toes into some of the PLG experiments as well. And then now here at Pace, I run marketing, but I also, get to speak to customers all day long about, the challenges they're having around transitioning to PLG. For the folks who are starting out, we call them PLG natives, thinking about layering on sales. So really have been able to see this from a number of different angles, and excited to chat with you all today.
Great. So I'll just kind of go through, the agenda real quick. So we had a bunch of submissions come in. We'll go through a bunch of them for about 45 minutes. It was great because a lot of the questions actually tend to be quite similar. So we're going to touch on most of them here. And then the last 15 minutes, we'll kind of just open it up to the floor for you guys. So don't be shy. If there's anything that you want to really dig into, I'm sure the boys are going to be happy to chat about it. So the first one we'll talk about is, what are some key metrics or qualitative data that would suggest that a PLG strategy would work?
Yeah, I can start there. So we definitely get this question a lot from the prospective customers that we talk to, but I'll maybe start from the MongoDB perspective. Like, why did we actually go through that? So again, for context, MongoDB in 2015 was starting to grow, primarily sales led, totally different product offering than what we ended up rolling out. I mentioned MongoDB Atlas, which is really a SaaS offering, fully self-serve, pay as you go, pay for what you use. That was very much board driven. I mean, I think there was collective buy-in there, but ultimately there were also competitors as well, so that were sort of going right to a certain demographic of the market. So more of like the startup type market, the mid-market, really individual developers that wanted to go out and, immediately get their hands on the product and start using it. So when you kind of look back, like what were the signs there that sort of indicated that it was the right decision for MongoDB? One, I think if you're in the open source world, that's like PLG on steroids, right? Like people can immediately get your product. They don't have to talk to anybody ever if they really don't want to, let alone, figure out a way to pay for it. I think if you're in the developer tools space, again, just like another qualitative data point here, your users are conditioned by their experience with AWS and by Microsoft, where they already have all these on-demand type experiences. So even if your product, say MongoDB, is better than an AWS like experience, because that experience was lower friction and because customers expected to be able to get their hands on the product, pay for it whatever way they wanted to, pay for it as they went, and not be sort of gated by having to talk to salespeople. Like we were battling against that. So I think that's another good data point. Like thinking about your customers, what is the experience that they expect? What are the other tools that they use, and kind of mapping to their preferred buying experience. I would say another one, kind of thinking back, like, well, is my product even a good fit? Like maybe again, kind of thinking about like a Workday versus say like a Miro like experience. I think one way to think about it is how many people need to be involved to make a decision to use your product. So something like a Miro or a Zoom, that's a one person, one decision, whereas a Workday likely going to be a multi-stakeholder sale. It doesn't mean that, it's going to be one size fits all, but most of the Workday type of experiences are likely going to be better to be for product-led growth. You may even think about breaking apart parts of your product experience and modularizing it and figuring out, hey, is there sort of a sidecar offering that might be a better type PLG experience to move people through? I think another one, and then I'll let Peter maybe chime in here, is even just thinking about alternative solutions, in other words, competitors, right? Are there others in the space that offer what you do in that product-led self-serve capacity? And if they are, like what's working? Why are customers going in that direction? They may just simply force you, unless you want to actually, forfeit a portion of that market that really does want to just self-serve. But I do think it really comes back to the user and the buyer. How do they want to buy? How do they adopt and evaluate software? And what are they used to doing? And what are they kind of expecting from you? Because if you want to make them go through your experience, you may actually not be able to acquire the customers you want to unless you do go ahead and offer that self-serve offering. Peter, would you add anything there?
Yeah, I think to kind of extend what you were saying around what your buyers' expectations are, I think like more and more industries are seeing that the buyers want a self-service option. I think the misconception that's floating around there is that PLG is the only option or is the only path to, revenue. There's still plenty of very successful companies who have an entirely sales-led approach. So, really understanding the why behind making this transition is super critical. And I think you'll hear us reference that, throughout this conversation. But actually, when you say like, okay, here's my product today, like, can we actually make this work? Yeah, as Justin mentioned, if you have a very like straightforward transactional single user product, those are going to be the easiest ones to create a self-service experience around. MongoDB is the example that we'll continue to reference today. It's a developer tool that an individual developer who has no database experience can get up and running within a few minutes. If you're selling like a more complicated B2B, solution where, there's multiple stakeholders, you need to sync with systems that multiple people have control and access over to. That's not to say you cannot be PLG. It's just going to require more work. It's going to require more product investment. And so an exercise I would really recommend to anybody who's either in the middle of this transition or thinking about going through it is, whether it's on a whiteboard, a piece of paper, and Miro, go through the steps of what it would take to get your product up and running for your users to be able to see value. And call out the moments where they have to, talk to somebody else in the organization. They have to ask for permission for something. They have to, stop and they're blocked by something. This will have two impacts. Number one, it'll show you where the points of friction are for your users. And number two, it's going to show you where you're going to need to make product investments to sort of smooth over those rough edges. Justin mentioned kind of sidecar products. I think this is an area where for those more complicated products, how can you start to show your users sort of associated value without having them go over those hurdles? So that's another approach. But yeah, doing that sort of user journey mapping exercise is super, super useful for understanding whether you're, you've got something that can stand a self-service experience.
Yeah. And I would add, as you go through that type of exercise, I mean, there's kind of like two questions here, right? Like, should you do it? Which, I think most people look at product-led growth, the opportunity there, like, oh, wow, like we have the ability to potentially acquire customers exponentially at a lower cost, and that there's a lot of organic growth. That's amazing, right? Like that is the holy grail. We all want to get there. I think the next question is like, why should you not, right? Like, well, where is this going to fail? Because there is elements of, yes, we need to set up the product in a way where folks can get to value quickly, which means not just the product, it means goes into documentation, what your website looks like. There's questions around, do you have the right people to make that happen? It's not going to happen overnight. So you may think about sort of how to slowly move the ball towards the goal line there. But I think there's definitely a lot of upfront planning. You don't want to get to a point where you really psych yourself out and don't do anything, but calling out that it's incremental, there's different moments of risk. And I think we'll talk about it later, but helping everybody understand it's not like you just flip a switch, right? It's really incremental. And it does take a lot of buy-in and patience from folks.
All right. I just also, before I skip to the next question, if there's something relevant to this question that you want a little bit more explanation on, like feel free to take yourself off mute and just ask. I'm sure it'll be helpful for everyone here.
Yeah.
All right. So what are the most important things to consider when setting up data modeling for user activity?
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to this. This is a question that we got a ton with the customers that we're working with, and it's something that Justin and I had to go through firsthand at MongoDB and myself at Gremlin. One of the things I really recommend is taking kind of two approaches to this. The first one is understanding the information that's going to be critical for decision making. What Pace does is we help sellers at product-led companies engage with customers in a meaningful way, but also, help prioritize who they should be working with. And so with those teams, we want to really help them understand, well, what information is going to be important to you to change how you're going to engage with this customer. So, at a very base level, understanding, well, are they on our free plan or are they paying us, is going to change how you engage with them. Sounds fairly obvious, but it's important to kind of set that out. And then the second things are, okay, so if they're using our product, to what extent are they using your product? It's sort of like the how much and to what extent. Do you want to know whether they've activated certain features? Do you want to understand certain usage vectors? And then really sort of like prioritizing that and picking maybe the 4 or 5 most important data points. I think the mistake a lot of teams make is they try to sort of track everything and start throwing a bunch of different stuff into dashboards, and then they create a new problem for themselves, which is, well, how do we know what's signal and what's noise? Starting with this approach of like, well, what questions do you really want to answer when you're imagining yourself getting on a call with a customer? What do you wish you knew about what they've done that's going to make your conversation with them more productive and adding more value? So that's the sort of the qualitative approach that we walk through. The second thing is the reality of sort of data systems, what's available. For that, I have a bit more of a pragmatic approach, like thinking about your data in 3 different buckets in terms of properties. So these are just like traits about your customers, whether that's the company they work for, like how much revenue they generate, where they're headquartered, maybe the job title of a user. These are sort of the static pieces of information that you might want to know. The second bucket is metrics. These are like the numerical representations of things that you care about. So, how much are they spending? If you have like a usage-based product, like what is that usage metered on? To what extent are they consuming that product? And then the last one is events. And events come from, the activity that your users are doing within your product. So there's really like 4 or 5 critical events that we recommend our customers get started with, and you can go a long way with those. So, you know, someone signed up, they've logged in, they've invited a new user, and then maybe, you know, some more specific ones about how they're using your product individually. So I actually think the most important things, just to kind of recap, is really thinking backwards from what information you need to know when you're engaging with your customers, whether that's face-to-face, you know, in a sales context, or in a one-to-many, like automated, scaled, more like marketing way. And then showing a little bit of restraint and saying, okay, let's just start with these like 3 or 4 things, and we can always add more, rather than trying to start with, you know, 25 and then having to distill down to what's actually important.
Yeah. And I think maybe just to go into like the business context a little bit, like what were some of the questions that we were trying to answer? So I'll give you a couple of real life experiences during my time at MongoDB. One of the projects that I was asked to spearhead was, it was really a pilot, but it was building out a sales assist function. So the purpose of this team was not to go out and talk to customers, qualify them, and, you know, secure an upfront commitment. It was really twofold. One, to convert free to paid users, and then the second was to grow and retain a book of pay-as-you-go customers. So what became pretty clear up front was what mattered less was our ability to do opportunity management, but what was more important was a few things. One, we wanted to properly segment customers, not just on firmographic data, but on the event and metric data that Peter was calling out. So for example, if I wanted free tiers, I want to figure out, okay, give me all the companies with corporate domains that are using a free tier, have this many users, and are showing, you know, run this many queries or loaded in data with less than 90 days. That's actually pretty difficult because oftentimes that data lives in many different systems, or it's not being tracked at all. Another example would be, you know, those pay-go customers. I want to think about segmenting them based on how they're paying, or again, based on those different user or usage metrics to pinpoint which ones my sales team should even be talking to in the first place. And then the second one, which a lot of folks talk about, PQLs, PQAs, really I think about it as where in the customer lifecycle these interesting moments where you should start to reach out. There's no magic bullet. You may want to use AI, ML. I think that's, again, like a good long-term when you have a lot of data. But if you're starting out from the position of transitioning to a sales-led, or from sales-led to product-led, you may not have all that data. And some of the best data that you have is qualitative data, thinking about talking to, you know, people that are talking to customers every single day, or close loss data, or talking to different product leaders, and really coming with a heuristics-based or best guess approach around how should we think about segmenting customers? What data will we need to do that? What are the interesting moments in the life cycle? How do we present that information to the sellers to run the right playbook? So that for us, like we evolved that over and over the course of 3 years till we started to get, you know, more granular about the different ways to do segmentation. We didn't have tools like Segment or a data warehouse, but even though we were a data company. So yeah, like there's a lot of prereqs, but I think it's a very collaborative and open process. And again, it really does go back to the customer and those different moments in the life cycle.
Yeah, and a mistake that I've made, you know, a few times, right, in this front is, number one, thinking that, you know, I have one opportunity to get all the data I need, and then that's what I'm going to have, you know, for the foreseeable future. Like, what I would really recommend is partnering with the folks in your organization who are, you know, collecting, curating, storing this data, and figure out a way to work with them so that it can be iterative. Because you know, I just laid out a couple of ideas about how to think about what data you want. Justin just shared how as, you know, the different experiments that were running changed, as the engagement patterns changed, like there were different data requirements. And so, you know, figuring out a way to say, hey, you know, in a month time or 6 months time, when we have new requirements, like, how do you want me to communicate that to you? Like, how do we want this sort of back and forth to go? I think the anti-pattern that, you know, I've fallen into this trap a few times, as I mentioned, is saying, okay, let me take this one opportunity, get everything I need synced to my system, and then that's going to be my world from here on out. Like, that never works, because there's inevitably something I get wrong. There's something I miss. So yeah, really like building that partnership and building an operating system to share that data is super critical.
Yeah. I think, again, just like framing up some of the questions that I pose back to internal stakeholders, because I think what Peter mentioned is you might go out and make all these requests and someone goes, well, why do you need it? Like, Well, why do you actually need it? So I think one of the frameworks that I use that was helpful as you move to this new PLG world. Let's assume that you're like fully self-serve, not a trial, right? So you can self-adopt, you can pay as you go, which again, the whole usage-based consumption pricing is like the other side of this coin. I thought about the sales, sort of the role of salespeople in this new world is one, you're actually engaging with a customer post-acquisition. So the product's doing a lot of acquiring the customer. Much of the job of the seller is to expand and retain. So I sort of thought about like the three questions that I wanted sellers to wake up thinking about every morning were: one, is this customer going to be a customer tomorrow? Number two, how can I get them to use more of what they're already using? Where can I remove commercial or technical friction? And three, can I get them to use more for, say, a net new users, new projects, or even new features? So when you have those questions in mind as the backdrop of where you're trying to go to, starts to paint the picture of the different data that you want to collect. Again, it's knowing every single login is interesting, but maybe understanding when they activated an enterprise feature or they deleted a large swath of users, those might actually be better indicators to help answer the questions that I just mentioned before.
Laura.
Okay, great. I'll move on to the next question. All right. Another big one. When should sales get involved in the lead journey?
Yeah, so hot topic. I think there's almost like another question of like, who owns the customer? Who owns the customer engagement, right? Is it marketing? Is it sales? If you think about the old world, when I say old, I mean primarily sales led, right? You come to the website, you contact us, or maybe salespeople are reaching out. You're qualifying them in or out based on budget, authority, need, timeline. You're running them through some sort of an extensive cycle where they make an upfront commit to get product access. That world was quite simple, right? You have marketing, then you have sales, maybe you have post sales in some capacity. A lot of the systems and the processes that were around it were really cut and dry. It was very clear who owned what. In the new world of product-led growth, or I'll get more specific there, fully self-service, you're going to have a wide variety of users. They're going to come right into the product. So they're essentially skipping the traditional flow of sales, marketing, post-sales. It's actually like who owns the customer engagement strategy. So a few things come to mind. You may run into different ways of thinking. Some folks say salespeople should talk to everybody. That's the best chance we have to acquire a customer. Other people will say, we don't need salespeople to talk to the customer at all. Just let them self-serve, and when they need something, they'll raise their hand. I think there's flaws in both of those. Salespeople may talk to customers that would have been acquired anyway. So you're just increasing your cost. And by not talking to customers, you may not actually be helping people that do want to talk to salespeople, or running into, high friction, scenarios. So at Mongo, again, we were already sales led, and we kind of got thrust into this world. And one of the things that really helped crack the code here, I would say I discovered by accident. We were running that pilot and we weren't having a lot of success in different areas. And I kind of went, full Dr. Michael Burry from The Big Short. I read everything I could, from emails to support tickets. And what I realized is that there was a pretty clear pattern. And the pattern was, we had customers that were coming in and reaching out. Their intent, they had very different intent. Some people were there to learn, purely learn with no project. Some people were there to evaluate for a project. It might be a pet project, it might be a real project. Other people were post-evaluating and they were implementing, and then other people were actually running the software. And what we wanted to do was think about where in those different distinct stages of the customer journey should we point salespeople, and towards which types of companies. And each of them had very different playbooks. And actually some of them were completely opposite. Some were, hey, this is much more of a service minded. So for example, if I'm trying to implement software, it's less about commercials. It's more about, how do I help you go from point A to point B? If someone's evaluating, they might have a whole set of criteria that they're thinking about running tests again. They might need access to different tiers. They might want to understand the TCO of working with you all. Commercials, that's a much more sales-led type motion. So breaking out, again, those distinct phases where in the customer lifecycle can they reduce friction, whether that's technical friction or commercial friction, and how do you do that with the right customers where it's going to make sense from a, say, a margin perspective. You don't want to necessarily do it with, have a salesperson talking to a student in, at UCLA for a pet project, but you probably want them talking to the senior developer at Netflix, if it makes sense. And that strategy worked really well. And we started to, again, we actually classify, we had a whole syntax around each of those distinct motions. I didn't necessarily call it customer journey because that's not as sales friendly. We had these sales motions that had underlying qualification criteria for each of them, how to figure that out, run the right playbook. We trained the full team. And all of a sudden, there was 2 out of those 4 that were really effective. We doubled down on those. We used data around product signals and where folks were kind of, navigating towards the website. So for example, if someone was had signed up, they were actually like almost seemingly breaking our product, and then they were looking at documents around how to migrate from one database to the other. Hey, like that's a pretty clear signal that they have real intent, real commercial intent. They have a mission critical project. That's probably something we want to dedicate the right resources to, versus someone that maybe went to MongoDB University, had a .edu type email. Maybe that's someone that we actually just go with a more automated approach.
Sounds good. All right. Next one. All right, I'll send this one over to Peter. How did marketing's role in the organization evolve?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to answer this question. I mean, sort of what were the immediate impact of having a product-led motion be the focus versus feeding sales is in a transition period, you usually don't get let off the hook for the latter, even though you're now responsible for driving your product-led funnel. And that can be really challenging. So if you're a marketing leader, like setting up expectations up front with your, revenue and CEO, with your revenue leader and your CEO about like, there's still only so many hours in a day. There's so many marketing dollars and calories you can spend. There is the question of how those need to be diverted. We have sort of touched on this topic of buy-in, which I know we're going to dig into a little bit later in the call, but one of the ways that having executive buy-in helps is to drive that conversation. If marketing is like, hey, you still need to help sales hit their pipeline number and you're supposed to fill the funnel of our new product-led approach, like that's just not going to work. I can tell you right now, you cannot do both of those things effectively. And so having the executive buy-in to say like, hey, we're going to, not have marketing focus on our product-led approach for this quarter, and you're going to continue to still be driving pipeline, and we're going to just let sort of the latent organic demand drive the funnel. I can't vouch for that approach, but the alternative would be, hey, you're all in on driving signups for our product, and sales is going to have to compensate by doing a little bit more outbound. That's more of the model that MongoDB took back in 2016 when we started really focusing on our product-led motion. Marketing's targets went pretty quickly from, how many MQLs did you generate? How many white paper downloads did you get? How many webinar signups did you get? To signups. How many signups did you drive for the product? As our data maturity improved and we got better at tracking things, it moved to, how many signups did you get from different channels? How much did you spend on those channels to get them? So thinking about cost per acquisition and efficiency. And then down the road, it turned into actually a revenue number. So how much self-serve revenue, MRR, are you generating per channel? And so that's a pretty big shift for most B2B marketing teams that haven't, been operating that way, just in terms of what metrics they're held to and then where they're focusing. Another shift, which I think is a little bit more subtle, and I think it happens more slowly, is the levers that you have that you can pull are a little bit different, and they have different impacts. So if you're really focused on a sales-led approach, you're going to be focused on, again, how do I generate qualified leads? Okay, we have an MQL to op conversion issue. So you're going to work with your sales partners and think about, how can you run sort of mid and bottom funnel campaigns to, to juice that up. In a PLG world, most of your effective surface area for influencing those metrics is going to be really product focused content, and then the different areas of your properties where your users are spending time. In a developer tools company, that's in the product itself and on your user documentation. For other products, that might be like a help center. But the channels that you have available to you and your purview as a marketer extends from not just, you know, what you're doing on your website and sort of out in the market, but has a much more larger focus on sort of where your users are today. So, you know, how do you influence the in-product experience? You know, whether you're using tools like, you know, Userflow or AppQues or Pendo or Candu, these type of things that enable non-technical users to influence the product experience, or whether you're partnering with your documentation and, you know, support teams to understand where those opportunities are and those touch points to forward those marketing goals.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing, Peter. One of the interesting transformations I saw take place during my time at MongoDB was in the early days where it was more about the sales led. It was heavy brand awareness, heavy messaging to like the enterprise. And I think, you know, if you look at MongoDB or even other just PLG kind of, you know, lighthouse examples, more of the websites almost feel like these how-to guides. I kind of make the analogy I draw towards is I think PLG is much more like e-commerce, and you know, Home Depot doesn't advertise about nails, they advertise how to build a treehouse, right? Like, and then, by the way, they sell all the things to get there. So if you look at examples like Miro or Figma, even MongoDB, so much of it is about educating the user how to get from point A to point B. Again, like thinking about those different distinct moments or stages of the life cycle, and then going a level up, like what are the right, if you're tying it back to revenue, like what are the right sales motions? The old sales motion was that qualified lead, right? So we would get into these interesting discussions, I'll say, around like, hey, like we created these many MQLs. Well, I'm like, well, that's not as relevant in this new world. Like some of my customers, they all have different needs, and I want to think about different ways to push them forward. So like the motions that I cared about, which are ones we commonly talk about at Pace, are a few. Like one, who's ripe for conversion, right? There are many folks that are going to go down that path, and they're going to just set up everything that they need. They're going to pay right up without ever talking to other folks. Other people are going to want their hands held. I think the next one is for the companies that have made that jump, like where are my retention issues? Where do I need to focus on getting them to a good place? Another one is really around expansion. Which customers that we've acquired are, you know, in a good position to go ahead and add more, spend more, and like where are the different data points that we can use there? Another one is around, I would say, consolidation, which is you have multiple folks that have come in, they're paying on separate accounts, but there's an opportunity actually to bring everyone under one paying account. Like those are other kind of interesting examples that you can use. I know I'm missing one, Peter, if you can help me out. I'm drawing a blank. I got it. Upsell, which would be the other one, which is maybe you have a multi-product portfolio and you want to think about, hey, who's actually a good fit? They're using the product a certain way. It might be a good fit for this add-on product, this enterprise feature. But I think as a marketing organization, it was less around, I just have to bring people to the door and hand them off to salespeople. It was more about, what are these interesting moments in the life cycle? How can I kind of nudge folks down that path? And how do I align that to the right sales play and make the sellers aware of when they should take action? That was more like the flywheel that we were trying to create.
Yeah, I think having like good understanding of what the customer outcome you're trying to drive is across sales, marketing, support, product, etc., is super critical, as Justin mentioned. So, you know, to circle back to this question, at MongoDB pre PLG, it was all about net new pipeline. Like, how do we get new customers, new revenue? So adding in, hey, we're actually responsible for retention, for upsell, for expansion as well, is definitely a pretty significant shift.
Yeah, that's really insightful. All right, next one. What are some things you have tried and realized didn't work, and how did you pivot? I know this one's a big can of worms, and we've got just a few minutes left before we open it up. So, but go for it.
Yeah, I'll say there's kind of two things, and I'll try to keep it brief. One was trying to focus your sales team on the free tier is, I think when we went ahead and did that, it was really low conversion rate. So you can do it, but again, I would expect single digit conversion rates, which you may just figure out is no better than if you were to just leave them alone. I think the other thing around that is even if you get them to convert to paid, they're not going to be paying much. So really like your ROI on having sales folks heavily focus on converting free tier, like may actually not be the best use of their time. So just being mindful of like how you put together that strategy. I think the second piece, which was more of a learning, was you could come up with all the right processes, all the right tools. If folks are not incentivized to drive these new outcomes, and in other words, if they're not paid to do that, they're not going to do that. So I think that's another big part is just like thinking around incentives and targets for not just sales, but again, marketing was compensated. Part of their compensation was how many MQLs can I drive? So if that's what they're comped on, that's what they're going to focus on. They're not going to focus on all the stuff we just talked about. If salespeople are focused on driving commitments, they don't necessarily care about enabling a positive experience from a self-serve pay-go customer. So those were just hard learnings, and you're gonna have to experiment your way through that too. But you could do everything right if you don't get the comp stuff in place, you're not going to see change.
So, Peter, do you have anything to add for what Justin had said?
Sure. In terms of, things that looking back, I would do a little bit differently. I think it actually reminds me a little bit of a question that we were chatting about a few minutes ago about, how do you know whether your product's a good fit for PLG is the reality of PLG, as Justin alluded to, is like you need a lot of top of funnel. Free to paid conversion, like best in class, is 10%. And so if you're already struggling to just like get folks to your website, get them to engage with like marketing content, like that's not going to be different if you lead with the product. It might be a little bit better. Like I've run some tests where putting a sign up call to action versus some sort of like marketing or, sales led call to action converts better, but it's not enough to compensate for, the drop off that you're going to get. And so really thinking about how you're able to drive that top of funnel is a really important prerequisite for engaging in PLG. And so not kind of assuming that once we lead with the product, once we have a self-service option, sort of if they build it they will come kind of thing. I think that's super critical. I alluded to the other one around just trying to be a little bit too prescriptive upfront about what data you'll need. As it said, like it changes all the time. It's going to evolve. You're going to miss something. So the more important thing would be establishing a relationship with the folks that own that data. And then the last one I'll say is when you introduce self-service motion, especially at a larger company with lots of different specialized functions like customer success or support or sales, every single one of those teams has the ability and the desire to now communicate directly with customers. So one thing that got quite complicated, at scale is marketing is sending, emails to users. Product is sending emails to users. They're sending in-app notifications as well. Customer success is sending emails. Sales is sending outreach, and then maybe support is engaging with customers as well. That is a tricky situation, and it really drives a pretty poor customer experience. So there's tools and things out there that can help you manage that, but understanding who the different stakeholders are in your organization who have a direct line of contact to customers and starting to establish, rules of engagement there is a very helpful exercise, because putting yourself in your user's shoes and seeing the amount of comms that they're getting can actually be kind of a eye-opening and not a great way experience. So certainly if you're sort of in the midst of that transition or, starting to move in more of a PLG self-service direction, definitely something I would advocate for.
So let's open up the door to some questions that you all have. I know that we might not have touched on every submission that came in, so feel free to kind of jump in, raise your hand and go for it, unmute yourself, or if you want to drop it in the chat, that's fine too.
I see a question here from Abhishek around basically is product market fit a prerequisite for PLG? I think the short answer is yes, it is, to have a sort of scalable and profitable PLG motion. Having said that, I think you can make parts of your product self-service as you're establishing product market fit, but there's no substitute for, speaking from someone at an early stage company, there's no substitute for talking to your users, understanding the sort of, nuances of how they're thinking about your product, the preconceived notions they're coming in with, the challenges they had. So two things are going to be challenging with a pre-product market fit product in a PLG motion is number one, you're shortchanging yourself on getting that really high quality feedback. And then number two is it's just going to be more difficult. Like you're just going to need to have a lot more volume to get more, meaningful signal.
Cool. What issues, maybe I'll just take the next one. What issues have you seen in the bifurcation of the customer journey from one self-serve to two PQA, PQL recommendations to building and getting buy-in? Yeah, I mean, we live this one at MongoDB for sure. I think for context, we very much thought of this as two separate businesses. We had our self-serve business and we had our sales-led business. That led to a few challenges. One, it led to challenges from the customer perspective because the customer saw, hey, like whether I'm self-serving the product or talking to a salesperson, I'm talking to MongoDB, right? And so I don't expect sort of one experience to be any different or better or worse than the other. I expect like a uniform experience. But on the internal side, like we saw these as two very separate channels. I think eventually what we realized was and by the way, the way we were defining that was this is a pay-go customer, this is a commit customer. Again, to the customer, they don't care. They're a paying customer. They are a customer. So that created challenges. I think the other part is you start to create the wrong incentive, right? I want to grow the self-serve channel, which means I want them to stay a pay-as-you-go customer as long as possible because I have to hit my numbers, when the reality is it may make sense for them to be managed by salespeople, or maybe sales customers that were acquired by salespeople really at some point were kind of, steady state, didn't need a human to overlook them. So like these were really one channel, but it created issues because we were measuring them differently, we were managing them differently, the different rules of engagement, and it got really messy when they crossed over, which was, again, was really kind of a natural state of being. I think it is a tricky question. I think it starts with like, one, how do you want to measure success of that funnel? You might want to think about like, what is the broader customer engagement strategy? Like when should a human actually be engaged? Okay, you might have for example, we saw this, we had someone that was on a Gmail, no one ever talked to them. All of a sudden we look at who's spending a lot of money. This customer is spending $30,000 a month. Yeah, we actually want to make sure a person knows exactly what's going on because yes, we want them to keep growing, but we really don't want to get surprised if they all of a sudden stop, right? Because we have no point of contact. So your rules of engagement, it's almost like you need a matrix, I would say, through that life cycle. When does it make sense? Is it based on how much they might spend because they're not spending a lot? Maybe they're spending a lot, but they're a company we never heard of, but we still want to think about what are those blends. In terms of PQA, PQL recommendations for building, and again, like our process, we started really basic. It was like, oh, who signed up for a free tier, or who put in a credit card? It was really, really basic. I think it goes back to like, how do you think about the segmentation? How do you think about the different sales motions? And there's sort of different, I would say, levels of PQL. Some are just, hey, you should be aware of this. Others are like, you should absolutely take action on this. Even at MongoDB, I think it was a bit more freeform. I think coming from our experience at Pace and talking to many other companies, I would strongly recommend the framework that I just shared. It starts with the segmentation and almost that engagement matrix. Who should do what, when, and why? What are these interesting moments where we want to make people aware of? What are other moments where that are like, hey, these absolutely require action? And I don't think you need to be too heavy-handed in the beginning. I think kind of finding out what's working. I think getting buy-in. One of the easiest ways to not get buy-in is to just totally exclude the sales team, to take things away from them with really no conversation. So one of the things we did was we almost had like an internal function where it was like roundtable discussion. We were very open with what was changing. We often, if we weren't sure, we had a larger organization, but we would experiment things down market, figure out what worked, and kind of roll those up as they were more hardened strategies. If you're at a larger company, you might want to do what they did with me, which was I had a lot of success in the sales org, but was, I would say, product minded, whatever you want to call it, customer minded. And I worked in the product organization, but I had the ability and the buy-in and the trust from all those sales leaders because I knew I had lived as a seller. And I helped drive a lot of buy-in on these different changes.
Yeah, I think Justin's point about like finding, if you can, finding a small test bed to start out with, someone who's maybe a little bit open to being flexible, having an imperfect process, being, less change averse, and workshopping it there before rolling it out org wide is super helpful.
Yeah.
To Justin's point, like we had several hundred, I think, 300 to 500 person sales team when we launched our PLG product. If we on day one said, your entire comp plan's changing, or you can talk to these customers or can't talk to these ones, we would have seen a mass exodus. So we were actually pretty conservative about, let's not rock the boat too much. Let's not disrupt our reliable revenue stream until we've worked out some of the kinks in like a safe environment. And then once we cracked the code, we saw that the PLG product could actually be more profitable than its predecessor. That's when like the more broad stroke changes happened. That was like years at least after the initial launch. So when you're coming from an existing status quo of sales wielding a lot of power, but also being the cash register of the business, like you have to tread carefully. And so one way that you can de-risk that process is, as Justin said, figure out where your test bed is, see if you can reduce the blast radius of this experiment, to use my languages for my previous company, and then scale it up slowly.
Yeah, I'll just give a couple more examples there. Like one real life company, which I won't name, they were all sales led, probably $20 million in revenue, probably 50 sales reps. They said, hey, we're going down the path of PLG, full self-serve, pay as you go. They said, great, no more NQLs. What we're going to do is we're only going to PQL when a customer self-serves and is paying above a certain dollar amount. Maybe some other kind of product events and metrics have taken place. What happened was about a month later, they had no MQLs. They had almost no PQLs. The sales team was totally demoralized. And they realized, hey, the reason there's no PQLs is because customers aren't even making that far. We have a ton of product work. They had to roll the whole thing back. They lost half the sales org. It was a total restart. I think the second thing would be, I remember an interesting quote he was at MongoDB. His name is Gabriel Madurier. He's now the chief growth officer at a company called PlanetScale. But when we were thinking about the segmentation of who owns what, he says, we'll get to a place where we have so many customers that sellers won't actually want to talk to them. That's like a great problem to have, right? So when you're low on the volume, you're probably going to be a little bit more sales, hands-on sales earlier in the cycle. When you get to a place where you're maybe like a Miro, their salespeople are working with customers so far down that life cycle. And that's like a great place to be. And that's like a gradual transition.
Yeah.
I'm seeing lots of questions around kind of like rules of engagement, whether it's tactically from organizing customer communications or, thinking about right person, right time. In both cases, I think as trite as it may sound, is like starting from the customer journey and working backwards. To Laura's question around like organizing customer communications, as I said, just sign up for your own product every once in a while, use a throwaway Gmail or whatever it is, and just see what comes into your inbox. Like, I think you'll be surprised by what you get. Maybe your own targeting isn't working exactly the way you thought. And then, it's a little bit of a project to go to those internal stakeholders and understand what their needs are. Unfortunately, some of that is going to be convincing them to put in maybe more process than they had before, or changing the way they do that. Change is always hard. But I think if you can sort of give to get, like, for example, when I was working with some of the support team and customer success teams, there was sort of operational work that I could take off their plate by having some of their communications route through our email system, which they were grateful for, even though it meant that they were giving up a little bit of control over when and how they sent emails. But in return, we got better visibility and better sort of oversight of how that worked. But I think at the end of the day, like if you can have segmentation that is agreed upon across these different functions, where it's like, hey, if they are free tier customer and they're not in one of our top named accounts, like we do not use our sales engagement platform to hit those customers up, and having an operations team able to inspect and enforce those rules of engagement, that's going to be pretty important as you start to see high volumes and a lot of teams kind of start to pay attention to that self-service motion.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of hitting on a couple other questions. Hassan asked, hey, no product market fit before PLG. How are you thinking about that with low ticket products? So Calendly, Jasper, who went PLG from the beginning. I mean, I think when you look at sort of the PLG native companies, they typically, let's say Twilio, for example, I think for 5 or 6 years, they were pure PLG and they grew that business, which meant like they probably invested a ton in the product experience, the customer experience. They got to a place where they were, driving probably hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue with no salespeople. I can give some real insights. My wife worked in sales at Twilio. She was sort of the first batch of sellers, but they ended up bringing in a COO who was former COO of Salesforce. Their mandate was not to just organically grow this self-service business. They felt like, hey, we had actually acquired many of the customers that we set out to acquire. Now we want to set out and attach to mission critical use cases. We want to expand the breadth and depth of our product into these other companies. We want to have strategic conversations on the C level that are attached to digital transformation. We really want to drive adoption and really embed ourselves in the organization. So again, thinking about Calendly or Jasper, like that's probably the route they're going. If you look at Calendly, they're starting to roll out more B2B kind of enterprise functionality. So you can imagine them selling into marketing orgs, selling into different parts of the orgs, almost like thinking use case specific, which also sets you up to potentially eventually expand into your product portfolio to think about what you could serve. I'm just going to go kind of rapid fire. The next one, you talked about rules of engagement matrix. If you hold users and let sales not engage immediately, have you taken reps off quota to a certain extent in the test bed? When we did this for the pilot, we created a totally separate quota. Again, they used to be compensated based on upfront commitments. That was out the window. We came up with our type of quotas that we wanted to run. We tried to incentivize them the right way. Here's what happened. None of them hit the quotas. The key part there was like, we did not want them to quit. So we did make the conscious decision to say, like, give it your best effort, run this. We'll figure out ways to make you whole, because these were really talented people and great thinkers that were open-minded. But there were moments where I had to talk people off a ledge. So if you're going to do this, I recommend, like Peter mentioned, maybe finding a subset of folks that are open-minded. Maybe they have passions to expand their career and learn, but you want to make sure you take care of them. If they're in too much pain, you may want to be like, hey, like, what's breaking? For me, and it was a big inspiration for what we were doing in Pace, they couldn't be successful because we didn't have the tools to help pinpoint which customers to engage with. They could, and when they did, they had positive outcomes, but I couldn't make that happen enough without the right tools. Because again, it was less about MQLs. It was more about segmenting the right customers and then pinpointing the moment in the customer lifecycle and catching them at the right moment. We actually just couldn't do that systematically. And I'm glad we did it in that test bed, because it wasn't just that small team that had that issue. It was actually the entire company, the entire sales go-to-market function. That was going to become a required capability for them to do their jobs. And that's, again, heavily what's inspired Pace. And Peter, do you want to take the last question on the comms piece?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit, but I just to kind of echo the piece about, like, if you introduce a PQL, does that inherently mean that you're sort of, cutting out some potential opportunity for your sales reps? Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But similarly, if you introduce a marketing qualified lead, you're saying, hey, I'm only going to give you a subset of the people who've engaged with marketing. But people generally don't think of that as, hey, you're sort of, taking sales out at the knees. Like, what you're saying is, we're only giving you the most qualified people and the people who are most likely to have a successful outcome. And the way you do that is you start with just taking out the objectively unqualified people. Similar concept in a PQL motion is instead of focusing on we're only giving you the very, very, very best, just start by saying, hey, we're going to hold back the folks that just objectively are dead on arrival. And that's more of an efficiency play. It's like, hey, don't even bother reaching out to these folks. We're just going to clean up the view a little bit so you can focus on the people with good outcomes. And then over time, yeah, you tweak that bar. And as Justin said, you get to the point where you have so many qualified customers that they're asking you to say, can you stop sending these lower qualified ones? And that's the more sort of organic way to set an MQL PQL threshold with an existing sales motion.
And maybe I could just leave one last point, then we can wrap, Laura. I think when you make this transformation, people ask, how do I comp reps? I think you're never going to get it right. So that means you're either going to underpay or you're going to overpay. My CEO said to me directly, I would rather overpay and build the muscle and get the buy-in and figure that out versus try to be, too cute, not have it work out, no one buys in, you leave. So I think if you're going to go down this path, going back to the buy-in, like your CEO, that person is likely going to have to be on board to probably overpay in the beginning to build that muscle.